This special shir is dedicated by my dear friend Reb Chaim HaKoyin Kazdin and his wife Fegi, Lila Nishmas, Reb Chaim's grandfather, whose yahrzeit was this past week, Reb Dov Berish ben Chaim Asher, and Neshama Shaman Aliyah, Shuv Meil Tziyosha for his whole family, for Simchas Anachas, Ad Bias, Goyal Tzedek. Okay, good morning everyone. Reb Matasio, the Baal Simcha, asked that we just have a few words of Divrei Torah while the mohel is preparing. I want to welcome Kvei Kedushas, the Kalever Rebbe, and all the Chashuv Rabbanim who are here. A very interesting nakuda to focus on when it comes to the mitzvah of Bris Milah. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Parak Nun, Esfuli Chasidai. David HaMelech says, I want to gather all my righteous associates, all my righteous friends. Karsei Brisi. He says he's going to gather everybody for a Bris Milah. But he doesn't explain why does he need to gather everyone for a Bris Milah. You don't need to gather people for a Bris Milah. You don't need, technically speaking, you don't need a minyan. It's better, it's Persume Nisa, but it's not halachically required. Why does David HaMelech feel the need to gather everyone? David HaMelech says very interestingly, Alei Zevach, because it's a carbon. Says Rabbi Meir, from here we see that there's an important dimension of Bris Milah, and that is, aside from the fact that it's a regular mitzvah, it's also like a sacrifice. It's also like a carbon. Rabbi Meir brings further proof. We only do the Mila miyom hashmini v'hala, from the 8th day and on. Just like an animal is only fitting for a carbon miyom hashmini v'hala, so too the Bris Milah is only from the 8th day and on. So it's very interesting to me. The idea that a Bris Milah is like a carbon has many halachic ramifications, not just like an esoteric idea. There's a shaila in halacha. Let's say you have, it's a Monday or Thursday, and you have one aliyah to give, you have one Yisrael to give. Who do you give the aliyah to? Do you give it to the mohel, or do you give it to the sandak? Who has precedence, the mohel or the sandak? You would expect the mohel should have precedence. The mohel is doing the Maisa Mila. The sandak is only Messiah. So who's the ikar? The ikar is the mohel. But the halach is, Ramah says in Sun Rei Samachay, the sandak has precedence over the mohel. But the Ramah doesn't explain why the sandak has precedence over the mohel. So Chassam Sofer writes in a tshuva, the sandak has precedence over the mohel because the sandak has two chalakim. The mohel is doing the Maisa Mila. The sandak is Messiah, so regarding the act of the Mila, the sandak is, so to speak, secondary. But says Chassam Sofer, there's another dimension. Aside from the fact that the sandak has a role in the act of the Mila, the sandak is the virtual mizbeach upon which the Mila, the carbon, is being nikrav, and therefore, for that reason, the sandak has, Adivus Chassam Sofer brings from the Marid, from Kadmoinim already, that this idea that Bris Milah is a carbon renders the sandak into a mizbeach. Interestingly, Rabbi Kivega writes in Yeridea in a note that we don't do this today, but maybe some do, but the one who should hold the child when the brachas are being made, the sandik should hold the child when the brachas are being made. Moreover, the yayin from the bris, the sandik needs to drink the wine. They do that? We don't really do that. I can't explain why. It's beyond the scope. I'm under a lot of pressure over here, usually, But why we don't do that, you'll ask your local Orthodox rabbi. But me'ikar hadin, there's an inyan that the sandik drinks the wine. Why? Because since Mila is like a carbon, and every carbon needs nisach hayayin, and you pour the yayin on the mizbeach, and the sandik is elevated to the status of the mizbeach, therefore it's appropriate, Rabbi Kivega brings, Rabbi Yaakov Emden brings, that the sandak should drink from the yayin. Also, another nakuda. Mechaber says in Sun Reish Samachay, the Avi Haben stands by the mohel, and he lets the mohel know that the mohel is acting on his behalf, that the mohel is his shliach. Okay? It seems like an innocuous halacha. Obviously, the father is going to be at the bris. If the father is not there, it would seem a little unusual if the father didn't show up. But here the Mechaber is saying there's a halachic imperative that the father of the child stand there and appoint the mohel. So the question is, why does he have to stand there? Let him call him on the phone. Let him send him a message. You don't have to stand over someone to appoint them. So, very interestingly, the Noisei Kalim right, the Bir Hagra says, since Mila is a carbon, and there's a din by karbonos that eich karbonos shel adam nikrav hu eino oimed al gabav. So there's a halachic imperative that the avi haben has to stand over there. Okay, there are a lot of ramifications of this. I just want to share one important idea. When we talk about that a Mila is a carbon, like what kind of carbon is it? What kind of carbon is this? We know there are many ideas behind carbonos. The Rambam says the reason for carbonos is to wean us off avodah zara. Is that the inyan of carbon that applies by Bris Mila? The Ramban says carbonos is to activate the energy of the various oilamos. What exactly is the element of carbon that applies by Bris Mila? If you look in Perek Nun in Tehillim, which is the Perek of Bris Mila, where David HaMelech says, Esfu li chasidai, karsei brisi alei zavach. David HaMelech, I think, gives us a clue at the end of the Perek what kind of carbon Bris Mila is. David HaMelech says, Zoiveach toda yichabdanani. One who's makriv a carbon toda brings me honor. So I think David HaMelech is being megala that the element of carbon by Bris Mila is it's a carbon toda. It's a carbon toda. We understand why David HaMelech says esvali chasidai, why he's gathering the people. There's only one carbon that you're required to gather a lot of people, because you don't have enough people. There's going to be too much left over. That's a carbon toda. So perhaps the element of carbon that applies by Bris is a carbon toda. Certainly, every single carbon. Every Bris Mila is a carbon toda, but I think when it comes to this Bris Mila is a very special carbon toda. This is a baby, Baruch Hashem, born to this illustrious family and very special parents, but it's a baby that we've all been mispalel for. El hanar hazeh hispalalti, we've all been mispalel, Be'ezus Hashem, that Tinoik ben Adina should reach this milestone, Be'ezus Hashem, and Baruch Shechianu v'kimanu v'yanu lazman hazeh. So we have the opportunity to participate in this carbon toda, to join David HaMelech, to join Eliyahu HaNavi, and we should all be zoicha to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim and have opportunities to thank Hashem for His hatava to all of us. Hashem should be meitiv to all of your families with good health, happiness, and mazel tov, mazel tov. Shkoyach.